All right, let's go ahead and jump back to the editor and take a look at the code. Again, we're pretending we're PHP, working through this code line by line. So we have some comments we're going to ignore. We have our function replace tokens with randomness, which we're going to skip because it's not being run yet. And now we have some new code. Let's scroll this up to the top so we can easily see more of it. So we're setting the number of inputs to 3, and the comments say show 3 sets of inputs to begin with. We'll come to this in just a moment. Our next line says if isSet post action. Now this will only be set if somebody has submitted a form that has the method of post. So this first time through the code, nothing has been submitted, so we're going to skip everything inside of this if statement. In this next part, we're initializing a token inputs variable, and then we're running through a loop. We're setting the increment value to 1 to begin with, for the same reason we set it to 1 in the previous step. It's because this will line up with a number that gets added to the end of the input name. And then the condition we're going to check is to make sure that I is less than or equal to num inputs. Now remember up here, we set num inputs to 3, so this will loop through 3 times total. And then again, the third part of the for loop is incrementing I by 1. So the idea here, instead of doing what we did in our previous step where we had 3 sets of text inputs for the tokens and the replacements, what we're going to do is take that line of HTML and run it through a loop. That way we can modify the number of inputs that we need for our form. So we also want to make sure that the values that the user types into those inputs persist between multiple form submissions so they can easily play around with the values. So in this first part of the loop, we're taking the value of the token and the value of the replacements. And the way we're doing it is by using a ternary operator first to check to see if the post value is set. And if that's true, we're going to go ahead and set token value to the value of post token 1. And if that's not set, that is this returns false, then we're just going to set it to an empty value. And we're going to do the same thing with the replacements. We're going to check for replacements underscore 1 in the post array. If it's set, we're going to set the replacements value variable to that value. Otherwise, we're going to set it to an empty string. And now we begin generating our inputs. So you see we have an opening paragraph tag, the word token, and then the number. So this will say token 1 the first time this runs through. Then we have an input that has a name of token underscore 1, and the value is going to be token value, which we set right here. For this first time around, that's going to be empty. And then we have the text and replacements, and then another input. The name of it is replacements underscore, and then it will be 1, and then the value will be the replacements value, which will also be empty the first time this page loads. So the next time this runs, I will equal 2, token value and replacements value will both be empty again, and the token input string will have another set of inputs added to it. This time for token 2, it will change the name, and it will change the name of the inputs to be token 2. And the third time, everything will be the same except for the number 3 will be used. Once we've generated all of these token inputs, we'll go ahead and scroll down here. We're going to generate the entire form. Now most of this form is nearly identical to our previous step, but what we're doing here is assigning it to a string instead of printing it out directly as HTML. The reason is that we have several bits of PHP interspersed in that HTML, and by looking at it in the form of a string here instead of HTML, it's pretty easy to identify where the PHP parts are. Whether you use this method or HTML and PHP print in order to print these items is entirely up to you, and will probably just vary depending on the situation. So for this, again, we have our form that's posting back to its own file. We have our instructions on how to fill out the form, and then we have the string input. This time we want to pre-fill it if the user has submitted a value in it. So we're using a ternary operator here. Notice that this is the first time that we're using a ternary operator without assigning the value to a variable of some kind. We're actually concatenating it directly into a string. So we're checking to see if post string is set. If it is, then we're going to return the value of that string. Otherwise, we're going to return an empty value. The first time this runs, this will, of course, be empty. Next, we're adding all of our token inputs that we generated up here. Then we have our submit button, our action button, and then we have one final hidden input, which is num, which will be the number of inputs to generate. We want to remember from one post to another how many inputs we should generate. And so we're setting the value to num inputs, which during this first page load will be 3 by default. And then we have the end of our form. So just to be clear, at this point we haven't actually printed anything to the browser, but we've captured most of it inside of this random form variable. Our final step is to print that variable, but also a new form that will allow us to set the number of inputs to display. So we have our second form here. Again, it posts back to itself. We have a paragraph that says how many tokens do you want to use, and then a text input that has the name of num, and then as the value, we'll be printing the number of inputs. This first time, that's going to be 3. As we wrap up this form, we create a submit button that says generate token inputs, and we add our action input in order to delineate this form from the other form that's going to be added to the page. And the value of this one is generate inputs. And finally, we print out the original form that we had with all the token inputs. Okay, so there was a lot there, but we worked our way down just the way PHP would when it generates this page initially.